For tens of millions of years, the only fish alive on planet Earth were the jawless fish. They are the most primitive fish alive today, and they evolved first. But then there are gnathostome fish, and gnathostomes don't just refer to fish. Gnathostomes are the jawed vertebrates. So not only sharks, bony fish, but also amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals are gnathostomes, jawed vertebrates. Jaws would change everything. Now, as I'll show you, it wasn't just jaws which changed. The gnathostomes were the first group to have pelvic fins. So here on a shark, in addition to the pectoral fins, there were also pelvic fins. And we care about these fins because in the next video, we want to be talking about the pectoral fins of the Sarcopterygian fish becoming the arms of amphibians, and the pelvic fins of Sarcopterygian fish becoming the legs of amphibians. So pectoral and pelvic fins are very important. Now, jaws, I'm going to be going to the videos in just a second. Jaws were significant. So when you look at, in a museum, these jawed vertebrates, this changed everything. The jawless fish were these little things, mostly filter feeding at the bottom of the ocean, which were food for the sea scorpions, which were dominant invertebrate predators, and the armored squid, the cephalopods, the orthocones, they were dominant invertebrate predators. But once vertebrates got jaws, then they then became dominant predators, and the world was ruled by invertebrates no more, that vertebrates could now eat larger prey. Where did jaws come from? Well, here on this shark, and I'll show this in the video, the jaws are made of cartilage. And even though my jaws are made of bone, they started off with this cartilage scaffolding. And then before there were jaws, there was cartilage in the pharynx. So the jawless fish had cartilage in the pharynx, and they had muscles which moved this cartilage. Now, what I'm about to say is, this is a new video. It's not very scientific. So I'm just going to give my commentary. So first off, here's a lamprey. Notice that lampreys have cartilage supporting their gill arches, and they have muscles which can move this cartilage. So you can see that there are muscles in the pharynx. So here, I'll just open this up. You can see, for example, the when lampreys breathe, that there are muscles, obviously, should get better in a second. So you can see there are muscles which can function in the pumping there. Now, lampreys, the sea lamprey, which is parasitic on fish, migrates up the Delaware into this area where I am and lays eggs. And so I was able to catch one with my hand. I let it go. Afterwards, we could argue over whether one should kill lampreys or not. In our area, they're not invasive. That's a whole nother issue. But in any case, if you notice, and this isn't, I wish I had gotten a better image, but if you look here, notice that the mouth is held open, but then notice in a second that it closes. I would have gotten a better picture, but I'll be perfectly honest, a little cowardly. I didn't know the strength that it could do that with. I didn't want to get my finger anywhere near that. Because lampreys latch onto other animals. I just want to make the point before we start talking about jaws. Lampreys have cartilage in the throat and mouth region, and muscles can move it. Once again, it was snapping its mouth shut, and I didn't want to get my finger, in the middle of this. So I just thought that that would just be useful. Because if you only see dissected lampreys as I had, you lose the ability that even before there were jaws, there was the ability to kind of close and open the mouth region, just because the cartilage of the pharynx had muscles attached to it. All right. So with that introduction, I'd like to now just become a little more formal with my treatment of these gnathostomes. Now, gnathostomes, the jawed vertebrates, are important, not because we care about, the fish from the Silurian period, but we are gnathostomes. And in a sense, I'm, this a little selfish and egotistical. I'm interested in how my body plan developed. And it turns out that it developed in a long series of stages. Humans are only in the most recent fossil times. Humans certainly didn't appear, at the beginning in the history of life. And so long before there were humans, there were animals. Then there were chordate animals. Then there were vertebrate animals. And so hagfish and lamprey, they are fish alive today, but they are fish without jaws. The most primitive fish in the fossil record and the most primitive fish alive today are these jawless fish. But then the sharks, the bowfin, the lungfish, and then all of the vertebrates on land, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, are all what are called gnathostomes because they all have jaws. So within the group of vertebrates, there is a subgroup, the gnathostomes, which includes those vertebrates with jaws. Now, I'm going to focus on jaws and things like fins, but there are so many other features which we could focus on. Look how big the cerebellum of a shark is. A lamprey cerebellum is this tiny region. I have a big cerebellum, sharks have a big cerebellum, lampreys have a tiny one, hagfish don't have one. And so it wasn't just jaws or pelvic fins, but we could look at things that, in the nervous system, the brain, the eye, the spinal cord tracts, which are things that gnathostomes share. We could look at hormonal things which gnathostomes share. Gnathostomes possess antibodies with and the separate segments, which allows the diversity of the immune system to recognize diverse microbes. Gnathostomes have a bigger heart, etc. So my point is that when the first gnathostome fish appeared, this isn't just significant for the history of fish, but the history of all of the jawed vertebrates, because these are the ancestors of not only, say, sharks, but also the bony fish and the tetrapods which come onto land. It drastically changed vertebrate history. So, Dinichthyes, Dunkleosteus, they could get to be more than 30 feet long. Before jaws, the jawless fish were little things that were the food for invertebrates. But once they had jaws, that changed the position of vertebrates in ecosystems. They could now be the dominant predators. As I mentioned once in the previous image, just genetically, something that seems to have happened is in between the first chordates and the first vertebrates, there seems to have been an accident where the number of chromosomes was doubled. And then in between the first vertebrates and the first gnathostomes, there seems to be another accident where chromosome number doubled. Now, this happens from time to time. You can find fish or amphibians, et cetera, where this one has double the number of chromosomes as its relatives. This type of genetic accident happens from time to time, but it seems to have been important in the evolution of both the first fish and the first jawed fish. All right. So where did this, shark and its ancestors get their jaws? Well, if you look here, here is a jawless fish, and there was cartilage in the pharyngeal arches supporting the gill slits. And what happened was the first two then simply became larger, more mobile, all right, and were then modified to form the first jaws, not only the upper and lower jaws here, but then this structure, the hyomandibula from the second arch, it supports the jaws. So where did jaws, which in, say, the primitive fish were made of cartilage, where did these cartilage jaws come from? Well, from the cartilage of the gill arches, which was already there. All right, and so, jaws didn't, say, appear from nothing. They were just a modified version of the structures already there. And in that lamprey that you saw, the muscles already did have a, degree pulling on those pieces of cartilage to open and close the mouth area to a degree. Once again, I have a more scientific conclusion based on it. I wasn't scared to get my finger anywhere near that. It was closing pretty hard. And so here, when we look at the shark, here's the upper jaw, the lower jaw, and then the hyomandibula. This then is derived from the first pharyngeal arch. This is derived from the second pharyngeal arch. So where did jawed vertebrates get their jaws? By modifying the gill arch skeleton, which was already there. Now, what I'm about to mention, this is more of a comparative vertebrate anatomy class, and so if this is a bit beyond you, then by all means you can disregard. But when we talk about the vertebrate skull, it evolved in 3 sections. The first part is cartilage coming from the gill arch skeleton, what's called the splanchno-cranium. The chordates have a cartilage-like tissue in this area. The jawless fish have a cartilage tissue here. And so here's the cartilage of a lamprey in the gill arches. And now obviously the fish then have cartilage in the gill arch skeleton. But interestingly, even I still have remnants of this. So as embryos, all of, we vertebrates, we develop cartilage in the pharyngeal arches. And this then becomes either the upper and lower jaw, say in sharks, the scaffolding for the upper and lower jaw in humans, or then there are, little parts of our skull, like the hyoid bone, the larynx, but then also the stapes in the middle ear, the part of the sphenoid bone, etc. And so these gill arches, if you were going to study the vertebrate skull, they're significant. And even we advanced vertebrates living on land, our embryos had cartilage in the gill arch in the pharyngeal region that then became portions of the skull bones, like my middle ear bones that help me hear, part of the sphenoid bone, part of the hyoid, etc. So this gill arch skeleton, once again, it's the reason to study this is not just because we find fossil, jawed fish so fascinating, but we're then also trying to understand, how the human form, slowly developed over time. During the Precambrian, there are 0 fish. Not a single fish is known from the Precambrian. The first fish are known in the Cambrian, but the only Cambrian fish are jawless fish. When did jawed fish appear? That's a hard question to answer because when you talk of jawed fish, you could say, all right, well, I have a complete fossil. So if you were asking the question, when does fossils suggest a group existed? There are trace fossils, a piece of, like a bone or a fin or something. And you might say, this looks like the bone of a placoderm. So, we can interpret, placoderms existed at this time. But then once again, you might be hesitant to, make a conclusion based on part of a fossil. You'd want a complete fossil. And so then the last I checked, you could say, based on trace fossils, that there were jawed vertebrates in the Ordovician period, but certainly by the Silurian. So somewhere between the Ordovician and the Silurian periods, there are jawed vertebrates. Now, by the end of the Silurian, there are 4 groups of jawed vertebrates. And since you have trace fossils of earlier fossils, the question is, which of the 4 comes first? So there are placoderms, there are cartilaginous fish, there are Acanthodians, and there are bony fish. The traditional classification, and I think the one that is most supported, is the idea that placoderms are the most primitive of the group, and therefore, perhaps the earliest branch from the jawed vertebrate fish family tree. Cartilaginous fish being the second most complex and perhaps being the second branch. Acanthodians being partway between cartilaginous fish and the bony fish being last. And so that's how I'm going to present this, because of these 4 groups, that I think is what most analyses have supported. Placoderms most primitive, then cartilaginous fish, Acanthodians, osteichthyan fish. But there have been different thoughts, and for example, some have suggested, well, are Acanthodians perhaps ancestral to placoderms? And so once again, if the earliest fossils are based on incomplete trace fossils, then one should just approach this branching pattern with a little grain of salt, with the idea that it might be modified when more complete fossils are known. Okay, so then once again, stepping back, uh, this is a jawed fish, a gnathostome, and jaws changed everything. One might argue that jaws were perhaps the most significant change in vertebrate history, given that before jaws, the vertebrates, they were little and they were food for the invertebrates, which were the dominant predators in the world's oceans. But once there were jaws, now that changed everything. And if you look on land today, it is jawed vertebrates which are typically dominating most ecosystems. If you look at the oceans and freshwater environments, the same um, the same thing. Now, these rays and sharks, they are the most primitive jawed vertebrates alive today. So the cartilaginous fish, they are jawed vertebrates, but more primitive than all of the bony fish. But if we include fossil members, there are jawed fish which are more primitive than cartilaginous fish. So cartilaginous fish, the most primitive fish alive, the most primitive jawed fish alive today, but at least the placoderms are more primitive than sharks today. All right, and as I had mentioned before, what seems to have been the case, we can, whether it be from genes and gene expression patterns, from watching the embryos of sharks, it seems that the cartilage of the first two gill arches was modified so that this then became more movable and formed the first jaws. All right, and once again, that lamprey can move its mouth region. Now, placoderms then are a group of fish which are extinct today. There are no longer any placoderms. And once again, to repeat, the first jawed fish seem to have arisen somewhere between the Ordovician and the Silurian periods. And the same thing with placoderms. They are certainly present in the Silurian period. Most placoderms will die at the end of the Devonian. So while placoderms are the biggest fish of the Devonian, the most common, the most diverse, so clearly successful, they are virtually extinct by the end of it in the mass extinction at the end of the Devonian, and they are completely extinct today. So of the groups of fish, this was an enormously successful early group, from big predators like the ones you saw earlier to flattened forms which could live on the bottom, much in the way that rays do today. Nevertheless, they are completely extinct. Like all gnathostomes, they have pelvic fins. Once again, significant because I want to talk about legs in the near future. So it would be the pelvic fins of fish, which would be the precursors for the legs of tetrapods. They don't have teeth at first. So placoderms lack teeth. It would be the sharks and the cartilaginous fish, which would be the first members to have teeth. Now, these placoderms would include little swimming forms. So these are small. You saw some bottom-dwelling forms. Some of these could be 30 feet long or longer. So placoderms were clearly diverse in the shape of the body that they had in their ecological roles. This group, which was extremely common, the Bothriolepis group, they not only had bone in their fins, but it was jointed. So this group is extinct. All right, so this group is not alive today. But as one goes from the primitive members of this group, where it's an unjointed fin, to having a jointed fin to long fins, they might actually have been able to come up onto, say, land, the shore near a body of water, and use their jointed fins with bone to then move out onto land and to move around a bit. Now, once again, they are extinct, so they did not lead to vertebrates on land. But once again, because they were such common fish, that the Bothriolepis group is potentially interesting there. once again, there were giant fish, the largest animals on Earth at the time, which now were probably then the top predators, larger than those sea scorpions and those armored squid. Although there was one armored squid which was perhaps larger than these animals. One of them. So Dunkleosteus and Dinichthyes, that might be synonyms for the same fish. One of them, Titanichthyes, was a bit bigger, but it didn't seem to be a predator, more of a filter feeder. So placoderms were an enormously successful group of fish. By the middle of the Paleozoic, they were the most common fish. They were the dominant fish, but they didn't have teeth. All right, so what you see in their mouths, these are sharp skull bones in the vicinity of the mouth, not true teeth with enamel and dentin. So that's a more primitive feature in these placoderms. The notochord was the support rod along their body's length. Once again, the Bothriolepis group, which is very common in fossils, might have had some ability to crawl onto land. Some of them had a flattened body, which would allow them to adapt to life on the water. There were small forms, so notice the coin here for a size comparison. But once again, some of them were the largest fish on Earth. Okay. So placoderms thought to be the most primitive jawed fish. The second most primitive group are the cartilaginous fish. If you've ever touched a shark, and lots of aquariums or SeaWorld and et cetera have places where you can pet sharks, you'll notice they're certainly not slimy. Their skin almost seems like sandpaper. It seems rough. And if you've ever touched a big shark swimming past, you could actually, produce the equivalent of, say, like rug burn or like if you fell off a bike and you got like a road rash, because just the skin is very rough. And if you look at it under a microscope, there's all of these fine points on the scales. Shark scales are very distinctive. And if you ask, well, what in the scale is so pointy? The interesting thing is it's enamel and dentin. Now, when you think of enamel and dentin, you're thinking of tooth stuff, but that's also the components of shark scales, right? Why are scales made of tooth stuff? Well, let's flip that question. Why are teeth made of scale stuff? It seems that the very first sharks did not have teeth, because no teeth are known in the fossil strata, but scales are known. There are fossils of shark scales before there are fossils of shark teeth. And it seems that teeth then might have evolved as just modified scales in the mouth region, that scales near the mouth, they just got bigger. Now, certainly lampreys have hook-like structures, but they're made of keratin. They're not made of dentin and enamel. So here you see the sawfish. It's a cartilaginous fish with a modified mouth. Shark fossils are sometimes different, hard to interpret. Here's a carbonized, remains. So there can be cartilage, but sharks don't have a lot of hard elements to their skeletons. So the cartilage and then their teeth, this is likely. And so a lot of the shark skeletons are known only from teeth. So we know, that this was shark teeth, but we don't know what the rest of the animal looked like, because, it doesn't have bone, for example. A couple of sharks have a little bone. It doesn't have a bone or much bone. And so a lot are known only from the teeth. Interestingly, I know this is just weird. I don't know how to explain it. But some ancient people studying the natural world thought that fossil shark teeth were actually the result of the moon. All right, and so it was once thought that the moon used to be full, it was a full moon, and now it got smaller and smaller, that stuff was falling off the moon, and that some thought that the shark teeth that you're finding were remnants of that. Silly. So shark teeth can give us a little bit of information. Some shark jaws were obviously, huge, and so we can certainly get that information. My children were among them. This is interesting. A couple of points on sharks. First is that the sharks of the Paleozoic were not the sharks of today. So once again, there are sharks today, there were sharks in the Paleozoic. They are not the same. For a while, it was thought that maybe the endangered frilled shark, I think it's native to waters around Japan, might be like one holdout from the Paleozoic, but the last I had heard that turned out not to be correct. So Paleozoic sharks are not alive today. The earliest sharks are just known from scales. So there are scales that look like shark scales. Remember, I showed you they are quite distinctive, but not but no teeth are known yet. So once again, it is thought that, just like Placoderms lack true teeth, maybe the first sharks lacked true teeth, and that, true teeth come later. The sharks of the Paleozoic were very diverse, and it's clear to see how different they are from modern sharks. So their body shape is different. The notochord is their primary support rod, and they don't have the vertebrae that many modern sharks have. Now, modern sharks still have a notochord going through the cartilage of their vertebral column. But there was less cartilage around the notochord of these ancient sharks. Some, like this one here, the xenocanth sharks, they were freshwater sharks, as far as I know. And I mean, they could get to be 12 feet long. So today, sharks are not primary freshwater predators. Now, if you look at these sharks, they certainly seem to have a number of different body shapes, more diverse than perhaps many sharks are today. The reason for that is that bony fish do not really become predominant until the Mesozoic era. And so the Paleozoic sharks just had fewer bony fish to compete with. Today, almost all of the bony fish belong to a group called the teleost fish, and all teleosts are known only in the Mesozoic era. And so those Paleozoic sharks, they had diverse body shapes, once again, because they didn't have competition from the bony fish, and also because there were two mass extinctions. There were mass extinctions at the end of the Devonian and then at the end of the Permian, and so most of the Paleozoic sharks died out. And it wasn't then until the Mesozoic era that the modern group of sharks evolved. All right, and then modern sharks can be very diverse. Obviously, there's hammerhead sharks like you see here. But then also, just as some placoderms evolved a flattened body shape, a number of sharks have body shapes which are flattened to varying degrees. And some sharks are classified as rays. So rays, like stingrays, manta rays, these are modified cartilaginous fish, where instead of going side to side with small pectoral fins, they have very large pectoral fins and are primarily using their pectoral fins for propulsion. So cartilaginous fish today include the sharks, the rays, and a group of deep water fish known as chimeras. So there are three groups of cartilaginous fish alive today. Many sharks then became extinct at the end of the Paleozoic, and then the Mesozoic then has new sharks. All right, so some were common during the age of the dinosaurs. Some would be the first members of the group of sharks which are alive today. A couple of ways that you could tell they had more in the way of vertebrae, but also their mouth, instead of being located at the very tip of their snout, was now subterminal, which meant that instead of having to swallow their prey whole, they could take bites out of their prey. So that was probably significant in the feeding of sharks, a subterminal mouth yeah, that. Um, Now, certainly, so there were sharks in the Mesozoic, and some became extinct at the end of the age of dinosaurs. Today, there are 40-foot long sharks, which are filter feeders, the whale and basking sharks. And then obviously great white sharks can be quite large, more than 25 feet long. Early in the age of mammals, the Cenozoic era, there was a 40-foot relative of great white sharks known as megalodon. So as long as the longest sharks today, but instead of being filter feeders, it was a predatory shark like great white sharks. Why? Well, after the dinosaurs became extinct, mammals began to produce a number of lineages which would spend time in water. So the early Cenozoic era was when the first whales were evolving, the first elephants, some of which would spend time near water, but then there were also demostylians, the relatives of manatees and sea cows. So there were a bunch of mammals which were starting to adapt to life in the ocean. And then at the same time is the largest predatory shark in history. All right. And so sharks have evolved in stages over time. There is one more type of jawed fish that I'd like to mention here, known as Acanthodians, sometimes known as spiny sharks. So what most people consider them to be is an intermediate between, say, the basal cartilaginous fish and then the bony fish, which would come later. They do have a shark-like shape of their bodies, but they have bone. They have bone in their head, lots of little bones. They also then have, bones in the pectoral girdle, which are shared with the bony fish. Now, some people disagree and feel that these are, say, like the ancestral form of cartilaginous fish, that sharks would say evolve from some Acanthodians, as opposed to being, intermediate between sharks and the bony fish. They were never overly common nor overly diverse. While some might have gotten to be 3 to 6 feet in length, most of them were much smaller than that. And once again, because they're not, major in terms of numbers, perhaps the reason to be most interested in these is because of their phylogenetic position. I apologize, I'm going through my notes here, just I forgot. With sharks, there were, some variants which were weird. So like some sharks had scissor-like jaws, some had a weird tooth whorl. We're not quite sure why that existed. Perhaps if you were swimming through a school of fish, that could catch fish. And some sharks had these odd, modified structures, which could include true bony tissue. And one set of sharks was there were two fossilized in the act of mating, and so it was evident that these could be used to anchor each other together. The largest sharks today are filter feeders, whose pharyngeal arches have then been modified so that they can, trap. Let me just pause. That they can trap a small. So finally, these Acanthodian fish, they were small. They were never overly diverse. They have this body shape that looks like, shark-like, with a shark-like tail. One of the interesting things about them is the spines that could be in their pectoral fins, which became more complex over time. There were a number of different body shapes in this group. But a body shape looking something like this is perhaps more typical. Most of them were rather small. Once again, one of the reasons to become interested in them is because they seem to have a combination of, say, the features one would find in a cartilaginous fish and bony fish. And so they have some, but not all of the features of bony fish. So where they fit in the family tree of the jawed fish, is an interesting question. So this has just given a quick overview of some of the most primitive jawed vertebrates. But one of the groups would be the bony fish, which will be the topic of the next video.